Is the other microphone available?
Yeah, they're working.
That's right.
It does show you how generational movements are. When you're young and you have not experienced what parents are speaking, it's easier to move forward. For young people, particularly in the room, I think it might be instructive to know that at the height of the Civil Rights Movement, SNCC had the largest, quote, staff of any of the civil rights organizations. All of them were professional and fundraisers. Tell us about how you manage that, and how did this quote, staff sustain itself as ragtag students without resources?
We first had an office in Atlanta, a desk in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which Dr. King had started in 1957. He gave us a desk in that office. We had one employee, a young white woman named Jane Stembridge, who was a student at Union Theological Seminary, studying to become a minister, and who agreed because Ella Baker recruited her to come down and run our office. She was eventually replaced by a young man named Edward King. You know what's so funny about the Civil Rights Movement? I think of all the kings in the movement. Of course, the Martin Luther King family were well known. Lonnie King, who was the starter of the Atlanta student movement. Ed King, who was the second executive director of Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the King family in Albany, Georgia, who were just mighty freedom fighters. All these kings, there must be something there. Anyway, Ed King became our executive director, and he ran the office for a number of months, but he had to return to school. He was at Kentucky State, and we badly needed somebody to take over. And a wonderful, wonderful man named James Foreman came from Chicago to take over the office. He was a little older than most of us. He had a greater command of thought, of strategy, I think, than we did. He had thought about this for many years before the sit-ins. He had written a book about a nonviolent Gandhian movement of black people, black students in the South. So even before, I think most of us had ever heard of Gandhi or thought about nonviolence, he had gone there at least mentally. So I give it all to James Foreman. He was the guiding light that took us from this little ragtag bunch of young people to a mighty organization with a bigger staff than the NAACP, bigger staff than SCLC, bigger staff than the Congress of Radio, bigger staff than any organization, and a better staff too.
You mentioned him. Yes, he was older than us. He left his job as a teacher in Chicago and came down and somehow got the confidence of students so that he was the executive director that held things together, because students went all over the South. He has a son now who is professor at Georgetown University.
Yale now.
He moved to Yale, so he had a couple of times.
Ellen, you shouldn't forget, and Julian, that even before Jim came to SNCC, Jim had identified with the people in West Tennessee, where black farmers living on plantations have been evicted for attempting to register to vote. So, and Jim, he had this commitment and this sense of dedication to stand up for those who have been abused and left out and left behind. So he was ready to become the executive secretary of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
One thing very quickly about him, he always said, write it down.
Write it down.
Write it down.
That's right.
Whatever you do, you say, oh, I did this today, write it down. So we're going to do this tomorrow, write it down. And that's one reason we have this archive among us, that we have records of what we did and where we went and who we were, I think, at least superior to those of other organizations.
What were your fat salaries that kept you alive?
I was the highest paid employee there. I made $40 a week. This is in 1962 or 3. That was the highest paid person there.
I think the average staffer's got something like $10, and then you had to deduct, I guess, taxes.
I had children.
Let me tell you why Julian's the highest paid staff. Julian played a critical role in SNCC. You sit around and you don't get the message out. At a time when before the demonstrations came violent, and that's the thing that we even covered, you got to have a scribe, you got to have a writer. The writer-in-chief was Julian, and it was a very important skill to have. Julian, how did you use those skills as a writer?
Well, when I was at Morehouse College, I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted my profession to be. And I was a little upset that many of my classmates said, oh, I'm going to be a doctor, I'm going to be a lawyer, I'm going to be this. And I really hadn't fixed on something. I knew I liked to write. I thought I was a good writer. I wanted to be a writer, but I couldn't imagine, would that be a journalist? Would it be a novel? What would that be? But I knew I wanted to write. And I started to hang out at the SNCC office when Foreman took it over. And I began to write press releases. And this was a difficult task. Then we had to walk up Auburn Avenue in Atlanta over to Exchange Place, where Connie Curry had an office of the National Student Association. And the reason we went there is because she had a mimeograph machine. Now, I know there are young people who don't know what a mimeograph machine is. She had a mimeograph machine. And some of you can just remember spelling that mimeograph machine. It was attractive in some way. I would cut stencils at the SNCC office and go up to Connie's office. She gave me the key to the building and the key to her office. And I'd go in the office at night and run off 500 or so press releases. Come back to the office. Eventually we bought a paper folding machine. I didn't know there was such a thing. You feed the paper in, it folds up in a little piece like this, so you put it in an envelope. And we'd have parties, we'd stuff envelopes, we'd lick them shut, we'd give them stamps, we'd separate them by zip code, take them to the post office and put them in the mail. So we sent news out about what we're doing because we wanted to be known. And I also developed relationships with the journalists in the area. And one I'm sitting here right now, that's Arlie Sharp with white hair. Stand up, Arlie, again. Arlie was with Time magazine in Atlanta, and he did a great deal of help in David Stern.
Julian was a really wise guy with that mimeograph machine. It was very hard to talk to him when we first met in the Atlanta office. You were cranking away and making nice graphs.
But one thing I remember, I was always trying to get our stories picked up by the Associated Press, because if the Associated Press in Atlanta wrote a story about you, it went all over the country. And if the Associated Press wouldn't do it, we had a good friend who was editor of the York Gazette and Daily in York, Pennsylvania, named James Higgins. And we could call James and say, listen, something's happened in Tylertown, Mississippi. Call the AP and make them send a story out. And he'd call the AP and say, I'm from the York Gazette and Daily. I want a story about what's happening in Tylertown. Stand up. Of course, if it went from Tylertown to York, it went to every paper in the United States. And I got so I can tell you now the telephone number of the Associated Press. If you call this number tonight, 404-529. I can't remember the rest of it, but until this moment I could. They would answer Associated Press.
Getting the story out was about more than, look at what we're doing. Getting the story out for SNCC was often a matter of life or death or injury. We mentioned Jim Foreman now. He was the executive director. John was the, I believe, third chair of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Now, I've got to ask you a question, because I have sat in SNCC meetings, and in SNCC meetings, Foreman, very good at leading meetings so that we try to come to actions we want to take by consensus. The reason for that was very important, because some of these actions were going to put life and limb in jeopardy. So he kept people talking on and on until we got consensus. Because you don't want to just by majority rule, go out there and get your head beat. And consensus was often achieved. John, now if it's an organization that runs by consensus, how do you get elected as chair of the organization?
Well, I have been involved in Nashville and Julian and his colleagues in Atlanta, since the days of Raleigh, I think, felt that maybe someone from Atlanta should be the chair of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Somehow, in some way, I think the decision was made that the office would be in Atlanta and the chair would come from Nashville. That's how Marion Barrett became the chair. And later, the young man, Chuck McDougall, from South Carolina, originally from Ohio, but he was a student at South Carolina State, right, Julian? Became chair, and abruptly Chuck decided to go back to school, to hang it up. And I was very involved, and I think people decided to turn to me. And it's not necessarily a vote, I think formal sort of engineered it. I don't know what happened, how it happened, but it did happen. So Julian, you probably know more about
John
that.
is too modest. John was elected chairman because he enjoyed almost universal respect within the organization. He was the bravest, most courageous person we had ever seen. And just everybody admired him. And he should be chair, except him. We're lucky we had good leadership. All the people whose names we mentioned tonight were good people who did a good job. But John had something extra about him, and I think everybody saw it. And said, this is the guy who ought to be our leader, and our spokesman.
Well, yeah, this is important to understand. In a real sense, this is reminiscent of how the labor movement chose its leaders. The labor movement during the 30s, when people were being attacked, the men who became leaders were the men who were the bravest, who went to the front of the line and took the blacks before everyone else. In a real sense, they had that same sense. Who had courage. That is the kind of leader you need, a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Julian, you were co-chair in 1968 of the Georgia Loyal National Delegation.
The Georgia Loyal National Democratic Delegation to the 1968 Democratic Convention.
The word loyal is important there.
Yeah,
Julian will tell you why, but it looks like you unseated the regulars.
Well, what happened is in 1968, they were almost around the country. There were no elections in most states to be a delegate to your party's national convention. This is true of the Democrats and true of the Republicans. And in Georgia, and with me here is Bob Short. Wave your hand, Bob. Bob has worked for every good governor Georgia's ever had, and he made him better. Davis, L. Miller, and going down a long, long line, so it's good to see him. But in Georgia, in 68, the governor who appointed the party chairman picked the party chairman picked the delegates. And the chairman, whose name was James Gray, he was from Massachusetts. And how he got to Albany, Georgia, I don't know. Owned a paper. I think he married a woman whose family owned a paper. That's what happened. He picked a delegation that had people in it who were not pledged to vote for any of the Democratic candidates, but who were pledged to vote for Governor George Wallace. And Wallace was running as a third-party candidate. So, and in a state that was a quarter black, he picked 3 black people to be on this delegation. So that was just too much. And Taylor Branch, a name that ought to be familiar to many people in this room, because he wrote the great trilogy on Martin Luther King. Taylor Branch and a young guy named Parker Hudson were students in UNC. Eugene McCarthy had come to UNC and spoke and impressed them. And they wanted to make sure that one person from Georgia voted for Eugene McCarthy at the Democratic National Convention. So they approached me, and I decided to help them. And to make a very long story short, we had a convention in Macon of people from all around the state, some from each of the congressional districts. We chose a delegation that was representative of Robert Kennedy, who was then still alive, and a candidate for president, of Eugene McCarthy, who of course was a candidate, and Hubert Humphrey, who was a candidate. And we picked them, and we went to Chicago. This is a long and complicated story, and I'll try to make it short. Well, I tell you, this is the most interesting part of it to me.